Okay, this is going to be, in the terminology of the last talk, more of a wizard focus. But I wanted to answer the general question of, we're making procedural generators, but why exactly do you want to generate that particular thing? What are you hoping to get out of it? So this is coming out of my research into trying to develop a vocabulary for better ways to talk about ProcGen. As introduced, I'm Isaac Karth. I'm doing research into procedural generation at UC Santa Cruz as part of the Design Reasoning Lab. And this is springing out of some of the work I've done on this. So I wanted to have like a very practical application for people to take away from this, and that's what questions can we ask about our generators? If we want to understand them better, what should we be asking ourselves to try and figure that out? So a quick overview. I'm going to have an intro here, and then I'm going to try and walk through some different lenses that I think we can use to examine our generators, and then wrap up with the conclusion. But first, I want to declare some variables at the top of the talk. So these are three terms I'm going to be using quite a bit. A generator is pretty straightforward. It's a thing that makes things. An artifact is a term that I've been using for a thing that the generator makes, which, yes, that gets a little bit confusing when I start talking about roguelike artifacts and generator artifacts, but we'll run with it. And then finally, and maybe most critically for this talk, the idea of critical lens, which is the idea that you can use a theory as a way to view and talk about something. It doesn't have to be the totality or the one way to talk about a thing, but it gives you a particular perspective on it. So my research was partially inspired by the generative tarot from Emily Short's Annals of the Peregrines. I took it in a somewhat different direction, but I encourage you, if you have any interest at all in figuring out why ProcGen works, why different approaches work, that you should check out Emily Short's work. And lastly, for definitions, what I've been putting this all under is an umbrella title of what I've been calling procedural generation poetics, which is thinking about procedural generation from the viewpoint of what effect it creates in the player. So that's how I'm going to be talking about these lenses. So first up, I have some lenses that deal with the form of the generator. Specifically, are we concentrating on the individual artifacts that a generator creates, or are we looking at the Gestalt effect of the entire forest? Another metaphor that I've been using is, are we looking at the unique individual snowflake that this particular run the generator produced, or are we looking at the entire blizzard of all the possible snowflakes? And some questions we can ask about these are things like, what effect does a single artifact have on the player's experience? What are the differences that we look for between artifacts? And then on the forest side, what's the overall impression that we get from this generative space? Do the artifacts always have a particular property? Do the artifacts never have something? Are the connections between different artifacts what's important? For a concrete practical example, let's consider the Forgotten Beasts in Dwarf Fortress. These are really popular with the fan base, and they're short descriptions, but they're evocative enough that there's reams and reams of fan art. And I've asked this particular artist if I could use these illustrations from some specific Forgotten Beasts. But the thing we remember about them is because they, whatever beast our fortress encounters has these particular properties. It matters that it was made out of bronze or water. One of those is going to kill a lot more of my dwarves. And we can also think about other aspects of the generator like this, like the artifacts the dwarves create, the masterwork engravings, the dwarf personalities. We can think about how the generator handles the individual details, and does it matter if, how many different distinct personalities can we get out of it? Another really clear example where this lens is useful is talking about games that have one single overarching generator that has a fixed seed. This was really popular back in the days when everything had to fit on a tiny floppy disk. So you had several games like Exile that used the generator to create these massive worlds that you could explore. So you've never really seen what the generator as a whole could make, because it's always working off one fixed seed. Though within it, like in Starflight here, there might be a bunch of sub-generators, like Starflight has this planet generator that can produce a whole bunch of different planets. And just a little history of ProcGen notes, Starflight is the inspiration for a lot of space exploration games that came later, including directly inspiring Star Control and Mass Effect. But we don't just have to look at the unique things. We can also think about the individual properties of things that we get in groups. For example, what's important about this particular dungeon level? What makes it stand out? Is this the dungeon level with the fountain? Is this the dungeon level with the stairs to the Gnomish Mines? And if we're tweaking our generator, what can we add or change about it to make different levels more likely to stand out? So turning to the Gestalt forest side of things, the example I've been using is that even though both of these forests use the exact same trees, they look very different. And that kind of way of thinking about our generators can help us decide what we want them to exhibit. For example, No Man's Sky deliberately made the choice to have each planet only have a single biome. So therefore, when you land on a planet, you immediately get the Gestalt effect of the entire planet. So you know that this is the planet with the bluegrass, or this is the planet with these weird canals, or whatever other feature is spread across the entire planet. And so once we see enough artifacts from a generator, you can start to see the patterns and get this feel for the Gestalt. I think the interesting thing about this is often the most characteristic part of a generator turns out to be the things that it isn't generating. For example, a default NetHack level always has one upstairs and one downstairs. So whenever that pattern gets broken, you know that something important is going on. I think Gestalt is something to especially think about when we're trying to solve what Kate Kempton calls the 10,000 bowls of oatmeal problem, which is you have this generator that can do all these different things, but they all look kind of similar. So even though the numbers are radically different, it all turns into this kind of mush. So thinking about it in terms of the expressive range of the Gestalt experience of the generator can help. And then players can use these lenses too. And I think this term from computational creativity is helpful. Framing in those terms is a technique where the computer explains what decisions it's made and why it makes it. And we can tune our generators to steer the player in one direction or another. In fact, how the generator exists in its context and how we describe it to the player shapes those perceptions. When I'm analyzing procedural generators, this is also helpful because I make analogies to different art movements. I think the motifs and manifestos that the different art movements valued is also something that we can relate to how our procedural generators work. For example, if your generator is more concerned about individual artifacts, it could be related to the way the arts and crafts movement was reacting against mass-produced consumer objects and wanted things to be handmade and individual. Versus if we're looking at a generator that's more on the forest side, we can talk of it in terms of like pointillism or constructivism, where the individual dab of paint or the red triangle or this particular room in the dungeon don't mean very much on their own, but when you put it together in a whole picture, it starts making more sense. Okay, so I call this next set of lenses the aesthetic locus because it's about where our center of attention is. Are we focusing on the artifacts or the generator? So I split this into, like, are we looking at the structure of the thing or the surface? Which gives us two different sets of questions to ask. Are we more concerned about how this was made? Why is it made like this? Or are we concerned with how does this interact with other generated artifacts? Or what does this particular artifact do? And I think there's a natural tendency for the player's attention to gradually shift away from the surface and towards the structure as you become more familiar with the generator. But on the other hand, I think that in roguelikes, the way that individual details matter a lot tends to keep the player focused on the surface even as they become more familiar with the generator. Because it matters a whole lot if that thing you encounter in the dungeon is a lowercase d or a capital D. You want to be able to tell which one's the dragon. And I think this is one reason why roguelikes have been so successful at using procedural generation effectively. And again, I think single artifact generators tend to push the focus more towards the surface, which is why, I think one reason why Elite was so successful originally. And then when we talk about surface and door fortress, there's a lot of examples. One I really like is the engravings that the dwarves will make, or the artifacts where they'll give you this really detailed description of just what it is your dwarf has constructed. But we can also flip it around because those engravings can reference historical events from the history simulation when the world was created. So even though the player can't directly see that history simulation, they can indirectly experience those effects and start getting a feel for what that history looks like. Another example I really like is the way that diamonds are placed in Minecraft, because they follow very specific rules. They're always found in clusters, they're always found at particular depths. And so the player can learn those rules, and though they can't tell where exactly any particular diamond is going to be found, they can generalize and say, well, I have to do this and dig down this far and have a pickaxe that can reliably take me there, and get this feel for what the generator is doing indirectly. Another example is this way that Spelunky guarantees that there's a path between the entrance and the exit, and it does this by having very specific rules for which rooms can connect to other rooms. So they're always going to be some way to get from point A to point B, even if that's kind of the long way around. Unexplored, on the other hand, rather than having the rules implicitly in the tiles it places down, uses a mission structure that's gives you a graph separate from the dungeon layout. So there's another hidden system here for the player to discover. There's a lot of ways to introduce more structure to stuff, whether it's adjusting the distributions, the hierarchy, One I like playing around with a lot is changing the contrast within a particular variable. So this level might have a lot of small rooms, this level might have a lot of big rooms, or having some particular unique landmarks to drop in. This is really common in roguelikes that'll have your usual dungeon generator, but also have an oracle level or the big room or something like that. And again, to recap, these are some of the questions about the processes that we can discern the structure or the direct impact that an individual artifact would have in our experience. So then I promised to talk about poetics, and so now that I've got these 4 lenses, I want to build on them and figure out what else I can say about them. Because if we combine them, there's a whole bunch of new questions we can ask. Are we asking, is this random artifact balanced for the way we've got the game set up now? Or are we looking more on the Gestalt experience of the whole thing, and but on the surface experience of the player, and talking about like how much gold is actually going to be spawned over this run of the game? So one additional way, building on top of this, I've been thinking about is talking about the repetition, where it's not about the shape of the experience so much as how the individual elements are similar to each other. I talked a bit before about the things the generator holds fixed, and how these similarities can often become the characteristic emblem of your generator. Emily Short has this term mushroom of the kind of not very unique background details. This might be like the way your individual rooms in your dungeon are kind of laid out, so each individual room might not be important, or it could be like all the text from a Markov chain, just stuff that's not super unique on its own, but gives you this like background carpet of generativity. And I want to I've been differentiating this from the other axis because it's a question of, is it repeating these columns exactly? Are they exactly identical? Or is it more like a fractal where this part is very similar to the whole, but it's unique in itself? And again, I've been relating these to some different art movements and how they approach the idea of rhythm and repetition. And then 3 more questions I've found useful are looking at how much multiplicity there is, how much cohesiveness there is in the system, and how well artifacts fit in the context with which they've been generated. High multiplicity is one of the big problems, I think, for a lot of people who are trying to generate stuff. My go-to example for this is that when the game Elite Dangerous was released, they had this amazing space station generator that generated all these different kinds of shapes for the different stations you can visit. But because of how the docking gameplay worked, they all had exactly identical docking ports. So whenever you were going to dock your ship, you always saw something that looked very close to this screenshot on the right. So finding a balance between those for your particular generator can be important. Cohesion, I talked about how Spelunky's generator guarantees that the different elements fit together. Spelunky always has a cohesive level because it's not allowed to place things that don't fit in with the other ones. So when you have a generator with this property, it's really powerful because you can basically throw whatever settings at it, and because of the constraints it has, it'll guarantee that you'll have a usable result. Of course, it doesn't matter how cohesive they are if they're still the wrong artifacts. So I've also been talking about style in terms of within this artifact, how appropriate are the choices it's making for the environment it's in, or how well it's conforming to what it needs to fit into. Speed tree is a really fun example here because it has tools to make the roots wrap around stuff and always fit in with the environment that it's in. And then some questions we can ask about these different dimensions are, what are the similarities between the artifacts? How much variance can we perceive across the generative space? Do the artifacts we're generating feel like they belong together? Do they fit in? Can we kind of perceive a cohesive system behind them? And then for style, how well do they fit in their context? Can they be adjusted to match the current needs? Is the generator smart enough to give us a water monster on the swamp level? Okay, so to conclude, this has by no means been an exhaustive list. There are definitely other ways to break apart your generators, other ways to generate questions to ask. For example, like I said, Emily Short's Annals of the Varigues has this 5-principle approach, and other people have built off this and generated their own 5 principles to orient their generators around. So to sum up, the takeaways I want you to have from this is that we can theorize about the effects of our generators with these critical lenses, which give us these questions that we can ask about the generators. And answering those questions can help give us a better understanding of what it is we want our generators to be. I want to emphasize that multiple lenses are perfectly valid. There's lots of questions we can ask, and your generator might find one aspect more important than another. And then we can use framing to influence how the players perceive our generators. So there's one slide with all the different questions, just for reference. And thanks for listening to my talk. Yes, I can take questions.
Cool, we have time for some questions. Does anyone have a question?
Well, people are thinking. I do want to mention that I'm looking to interview people about what they want to do with procedural generation in the future, what problems they've been running into, stuff like that. So please do contact me if you're interested in influencing the future direction of research.
Hey, so great talk. My question was just kind of leading into things I want to do with procedural generation. I think that the structure versus surface distinction is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you had any thoughts in terms of, like you mentioned, some of how the user experience in roguelikes kind of tends itself one way or another, how to encourage the user or the player to pick up on the structure. I feel like sometimes when you see players kind of bouncing off certain things with proc-gen mechanics, it might be because they're not seeing that there is a structure. They're too focused on the surface, and so they tend to just call it random and move on. So yeah, any thoughts in terms of how to encourage a player to keep the structure in mind as well as the surface?
One way is just foregrounding some of the causality. For example, one thing a lot of roguelikes do is track what caused a particular damage to the player or to anything. So NetHack actually has passes around where did this damage originally come from whenever something hits something else. And that means that when it prints it out for the player, when they die, the player knows exactly, oh, this thing hit this thing that killed me. And I think extending that idea to other parts of your generator of giving a bit more foregrounding to the causes behind things can really help bring out the structure. For example, if a particular if your generator is generating like a particular kind of room, or using a particular technique to generate that kind of room, maybe give that like a unique style, so they can tell when they don't necessarily like know which part of the generator did that, but they know, oh, when I start to see this floor pattern, that means that it has these other associations with it.
Other questions?
Just a general question. You know, I've run across various proc gen techniques everywhere. I don't know of like one seminal, fairly modern reference that would kind of give me a good overview of all the good ones that are in application. And do you have any recommendations of some literature?
Overview of all the possible ones.
I mean, all the known ones, I guess.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple books that I am currently blanking on the titles of, though some of the editors are in the audience. So actually the first chapter of the procedural generation book that Tarn edited with Tanya Short has like a really good list of a bunch of different techniques, a bunch of different questions. There's a bunch of different techniques covered in there. Kate Compton also has a rather popular blog post that lists a bunch of stuff of, I believe it's titled, So you want to build a generator. Thanks, Kate. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
I didn't catch
the other book was called Procedural Generation in Game Design.
Procedural Generation Game Design. Thanks.
We have time for one more question. If you have your hand up, you should wave it.
Yeah.
Vigorously. Anyone?
You have the title of your talk being this great question, why do you want to generate that?
Yeah.
Could you work through an example of how you would use your vocabulary that you laid out on that last slide to answer this kind of question?
Okay, so let's pick something to generate. So Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup has the ability to add different, like, basically room templates. And so I'm trying to decide what room template that I want to mod in to add a particular effect. So the first question is, what effect does this particular room have? How does that change its relation to the other rooms that are being generated? So say I want to like start emphasizing different classes and their experience, or different races. So like say I want to have a like Minotaur themed room or a ogre themed room, and have a different experience for if the player is playing that class versus not playing that class. So start thinking about like what are the differences between these rooms. So if I set up these, so if I'm laying out, here's the rooms I want to add to the generator, how am I going to make them different from each other? And then what's the overall impression? How does this change the rooms that the player is experiencing? It's only going to show up, because there's already a lot of rooms in the game that can be added, it's only going to show up a little bit of time, so I have to think about, is it going to matter if I only see like one of these? Do I want to have a level where I force a bunch of them to show up, like the temple does with the gods in the game? And then for repetition, I want to think about like, maybe I want to make these rooms all kind of like a similar shape, so when the player sees one of these, they know what's coming up. And then for structure and surface, it's things like, so when the player encounters this room, what are they going to be thinking about? I've already wanted to like clue them in that this challenge is going to be coming up. So maybe it's a challenge that's particularly easy or hard for a particular class, and so to know that if they're playing this class, they should be looking out for it because it's like give them a big advantage. If they're not playing the class, maybe they want to avoid it and try and find out another solution to the problem. And then thinking about how do I want to foreground this structure of the player? So like I said, maybe I want to make these a unique shape or like highlight them, or if I want to clue the player in that they're like going to be coming up, maybe scatter some other clues around the level. NetHack actually uses its sound system to do this, so you can hear things that you haven't discovered yet. That gives you a clue as to what kind of level you're on. So that's another way that NetHack exhibits part of its structure. And then these other questions of like, how much variety do we want to see in these different rooms? Maybe we want them to all, because we've got enough other rooms, maybe these rooms are always the same every time the player encounters them, or maybe we want to have some more, variation so that the player doesn't know exactly what the challenge is going to be. There's different strengths and weaknesses to mixing like a fixed thing in with your generator versus always having it be very changeable. And then, do these rooms feel like they belong with the rest of the game? Do they because I'm modding Dungeon Crawl, so I don't want to drop in something that would be completely out of place. So I wanted to kind of fit in with the rest of the stuff. I don't want it to disrupt the rest of the levels that they're being placed on. I don't want to unbalance the game too much by giving too strong or too many rewards or not enough rewards, or like having like a way out of depth monster. And then speaking of way out of depth monsters, can we adjust these rooms to fit in the level that they're generated on? Do they respect the difficulty? Do they play in with the other aspects of the generator? So I hope that answers the question.
Cool, thank you.